go ahead and get started. I think as we move on to this and the next topic and the one after that, it's kind of a nice break in terms of where we were. We were kind of enumerating all sorts of software vulnerabilities and web applications, and that's still important and relevant things. And now it's also a necessary and important topic, but it's kind of a clean break as well. So you've seen a little bit of that, those of you who've started the lab for this week, but this next topic is that of physical security, which there's a limit to how much we can do in a lab, a virtualized lab environment with regards to physical security, but we'll play around with a couple of things as you've seen in that relatively short lab for this week. So by physical security, I mean exactly what it sounds like. So physical access, securing the physical perimeters or physical inputs to a machine, to a device. It tends to not directly relate to sort of the remotely accessible software vulnerabilities that we've been talking about, but we'll see that as more and more things are sort of virtualized, put in the cloud, put in data center, there is a little bit of connection between what we had previously just talked about and what we're doing now with regards to physical security. Because otherwise, that's what we tend to focus on in a class like this. Things like firewalls and intrusion protection and the appropriate use of cryptography and other techniques for authenticating in our systems. But we should actually also care about the physical security of our devices, and especially those things that are mobile. We can easily find dozens and dozens of stories about devices getting stolen, devices being left somewhere on a subway in a public location, and the same kind of things that were maybe otherwise perfectly protected in terms of user authentication, in terms of removing all the known software weaknesses and making sure everything's patched. A lot of that kind of falls apart once you have lost sort of physical access and there's been a breach of your physical security of your premises or of the particular devices. This is meant to be kind of a funny video, at least I found it funny. The point of this, I think, is physical security can be just as hard to implement as software or as cyber security. I actually don't know if this is going to play live on the recording I have, but I'll sort of describe what it is. So this is a key code on a gate for like an apartment complex or something like that. And I'm going to turn off the audio. That's someone laughing because they find it hilarious. So they're trying to figure out the key code. They're typing in the wrong key code. And then what's wrong with that door? They can just first off, they can just reach through. So physical security for that reason, that guy's just laughing. It looks like he's having conniptions. Other issues that can be, you may have this gate, and then the gate is really not protecting anything either. So that was meant to be funny. Physical security is actually very hard to do correctly as well. In that case, there probably was some requirement that there be some gate with some key code, but not actually any requirement that it be effective here. When we have these mobile devices, when we have these devices that we take with us, just our phones, of course, laptops, tablets, USB drives, and things like that, they themselves become sort of a separate attack vector or risk for our organization. Just threat in and of itself of it being stolen. So the sensitive data that the device may already have stored on it, the ability to maybe potentially already be authenticated to an existing network is a separate threat here. And you can easily find dozens and dozens of stories similar to the one that I just happened to find and posted here, which is data of X thousand number of people was breached after theft of a single laptop here. And you can think of disk encryption as being a mitigation for mobile device security, and it technically is. It really depends on the manner of device drive encryption and to what extent there's sort of known vulnerabilities or workarounds with regards to that. It also depends on the relative value of the data that's potentially stored encrypted on that particular device, how much effort would go into decrypting that drive, that device there. But in general, encrypted or not, even if that is a potential mitigation, that device getting stolen is itself a pretty big risk. It's a pretty big threat to the rest of the organization, which may be doing a lot of the other things correctly in terms of organization of our network, in terms of performing various reconnaissance and monitoring of our devices of our system here. Doesn't necessarily require theft either. I mean, that's one way. Obviously, we worry about physical security. If an attacker has actual physical access to the computer, there are all sorts of things they can do, right? If someone can plug in an external drive, an external flash drive to a computer, all sorts of things become possible at that point. So whether they have physical access or Historically, it was a known thing that if people would just leave a flash drive on the ground, there's a potential likelihood that someone who would then pick it up would be curious. I found a flash drive, probably back in an era where maybe a flash drive was considered a slightly more valuable thing than perhaps it is sort of a disposable thing these days. But there was one point in time where you found a flash drive on the ground and you realized, hey, that's great, new flash drive. I needed one of those. But the thought is perhaps someone who's either naive or unexpecting would then go plug it into a particular machine. And that may be thought of as just a device that is just storing things, but we know under the hood there is some sort of computer on every one of those flash drives, right? It may be an embedded processor, it may be relatively small or feeble in terms of the computational power it has, but you can these days fit a lot of computer inside something of this form factor. And so what we played around very briefly with before class, and this was mentioned in the lab, was the USB rubber ducky here. Looks like a USB stick, pretends to just be a keyboard, which actually makes it a little bit more difficult to detect and can deliver, I'll put malicious in quotes, payloads here. As I plug this one in here so you can see what it does. This version of the USB rubber ducky effectively just acts as a keyboard. So as a programmable keyboard. So when we plug it in, it will deliver a payload, and that payload is effectively keystrokes only, which may sound limiting, and it is kind of limiting, that it's just delivering keystrokes only. But in a lot of systems, you can do a lot with keystrokes, right? Most modern web applications, for example, have all sorts of built-in keyboard shortcuts to be able to use the application without requiring a mouse. And most operating systems have those as well. So it does turn out in practice that even if you were have something that was just going to act as a keyboard and just basically delivering key presses as an attack vector, you can do a lot of harm with that. And depending on how much time, how clever you want to be. I like the USB rubber ducky because it's so straightforward and kind of fun to play with. There's a lot of very similar devices sold by this, I don't know, Hack5 or organization here. And it comes with its own sort of Arduino style editor and environment if you want to change the payloads associated with it. Again, payload here basically just means key presses. They sort of encode them directly as strings or just special key presses. But with that, then like I said, you can do a lot of things. Just to show what that particular payload was, so those are just comments. So after it's plugged in, wait a second and a half. I can play around with that to see how long you would want to wait. You may want to wait several hours depending on what your actual goals are. In this case, just wait for a second and a half. Press Windows R, which opens up the Windows Run dialog. So this wouldn't work on alternate operating systems, but in more up-to-date versions of this hardware and software, you can detect what OS you're in first and then do different things depending on which operating system you're on. Open up the dialog, wait half a second, and type in PowerShell with just kind of an arbitrary PowerShell command to open up a message box. And that's all that showed up in that example. And then press the Enter key to execute it. That does seem kind of limiting, and it is kind of limiting, to be honest, in practice. But there's still a lot of fun things you can do. If you know anything at all about the target system and there's a particular need you have, you can certainly open up a web browser and navigate to a particular website. And then from within that website, potentially do all sorts of things. The one I was playing around with but kind of ran out of time here, if we comment this one out and instead grab the one that I have here, which was let's open up as a quote unquote hacker, let's open up Discord, string, open up Discord, then we would have to press enter, and then that would be whatever default channel I happen to have open in Discord. What do we want it to say? I don't know. Whoops, Zambrino plugged in the rubber ducky again. Something like that, and then press enter again here. So it's kind of like an Arduino style environment. It's even more limited than that, right? Because you're really just, in this case, encoding very basic type of commands. You can do if statements and loops and things like that. But then you're just generating effectively a tiny little firmware. I actually don't know if this is going to work live, but since we're all here and waiting, this is the older version of the rubber ducky, so I actually have to crack it open and grab the micro SD card out of there. Not great for someone without any sharp fingernails, but give me just a second, see if I can get it here. Cracking it open is one thing, getting it put back together is something else entirely. So we hit, I don't know if I hit download, let me hit download. I have it there. You can see that was the last few things. You have one of these like any kind of Arduino or really tiny embedded platform, one of these little micro SD cards, which we can then plug in here and just overwrite the firmware. That's kind of inconvenient if you were really wanting to play around with that. More up-to-date versions of it have just a USB port that you can just plug in. It can get loaded as a flash drive directly, so you don't have to play around with that. It doesn't look like that worked when I plugged it in here. Let's give it another try. And it's okay if it doesn't work. We don't have to do a live change. Okay, so there's that. Let's delete the one that's on there. Let's grab the more up-to-date one. Let's throw it on there. Somewhere that timestamp looks reasonably close. I don't know to what extent I actually need to eject these devices, but let's actually eject that device and then plug it back into the rubber ducky. This has not been tested. I won't even put the whole thing back together. It should still work. Plug it in. The biggest USB device security is not knowing how to plug these in properly. We needed to wait a little bit more second in our payload. Should we try it again? Okay, so typed in string, typed in enter. You know, it's kind of hard to say for certain exactly how long it'll take for Discord to pop back up. Delay, I don't know, let's delay another 2 seconds, right? We're not trying to be superbly stealthy here. So let's do it again. I think that worked. Got the right timestamp. Hit download again. Let's try it all one more time. And now every time, I think the way I've encoded that though, that would only work for me. So anytime I plug this in, you'll know because I'll post something in the default channel I have open in Discord. It's kind of dangerous actually. So we'll wipe this after we're done with it. Don't know if I hit download. Let me do it again. I think I had already hit download. Let me grab this one. Let's try it one more time. I will not try it a fourth time. Okay, got it. Let's eject it. And plug it in, types all that stuff again. So Discord was 2 seconds enough. Whoops, I'm going to plug it in. So there we go. Kind of fun. But now I should make sure to make a mental note not to do that again, because then every time I'm on my computer and I plug it back in, it's going to just do it again. And those of you who weren't in class today have no idea what we're talking about. The poor TAs are going to be very confused what's happening here with this poor system here. Okay. So I will not plug that back in. Questions about rubber duckies? Sure.
So if you have a delay like 3 hours and you unplug the USB, would it stop? Would it
I don't think so. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, we could, if we wanted to, we could really. We probably have the skill set to kind of look, not in this dark room, you know, what chipset, what little kind of basic little Arduino type device this is. But almost certainly, it's not going to have sort of flash storage for its own runtime. So it probably resets every time you unplug it. But I haven't played with that. Depends how stealthy you want to be, I guess, as well. I think one possible takeaway, I think this is my personal reasonable conclusion, is once physical access has been breached, once you've left your computer in a room with someone you do not trust, you know, you should probably assume your entire network is compromised. May not be the case, right? We don't know what someone's intentions are. Maybe they just wanted to post something to chat and, you know, be a little bit of a griefer. But once it's been breached, once you no longer have physical control or direct monitoring of the physical access to your devices on your network, you probably have to assume that the entire network itself has been compromised. Kind of a sort of a political thing, but there was a lot of cybersecurity implications of sort of the U.S. Capitol IT infrastructure from early 2021. And a lot of articles kind of showed that, well, based on that, it really just took one truly malicious agent to be in place to kind of, effectively take over the entire U.S. Capitol and IT network. As far as I can tell, not that those things are necessarily published when they do happen. It does not appear to me, based on what I can find, that a full rebuild of the network happened in 2021. So not necessarily following best practices there. There have been a lot of very famous USB related incidents. So this is not just a fun toy. It's also meant to be a proof of concept of, what can really go wrong with one. In 2008, a USB drive was plugged into US Central Command and started to spread a very difficult to clean worm, the Agent BTZ worm, that based on that policy, based on what happened in 2008, there was effectively a policy implemented that, USB drives were going to be subsequently banned. Pluggable devices were going to be subsequently banned. That turns out to be a more difficult ban to actually implement in practice than it sounds. It's one of those things that sounds reasonable. Okay, do not, disable all USB on all DoD or all organizations' computers. In practice, that's quite difficult, right? Now, we may think of our phones and our laptops where on a day-to-day basis, we don't need our USB ports to be functioning for us to be able to get work done. But there's a lot of other computing environments where that's not the case, right? This rubber ducky shows up as a keyboard. You're very much limiting your organization if you're preventing USB keyboards from being plugged in, right? Same with storage as well. There's an actual reason we have these things. There's a need that they're fulfilling. It can actually be quite difficult to do that in practice. And in fact, you'll read an article that says something that, the DoD is saying, we're banning all USB drives and we're disabling that on all computers by default. That's clearly not been the case. There's been, several subsequent incidents that are also basically USB thumb drive based incidents that caused all sorts of problems after the fact. Yeah.
Can you set a configuration where it's like if there is already a keyboard plugged in, do not allow a second keyboard?
Yes. And so specifically, if you really were worried about rubber ducky, you could say, and it has a unique device ID associated with it, and it's required to register as a particular device, you could ban that device or ban the second keyboard that gets plugged in. There are reasonable things, one can do. But it seems to me, and I'm drawing a couple of inferences that aren't really, there's not really a direct line from that 2008 well-known incident to the 2017 very well-known incident. But clearly there was some intended policy, and then in reality, it was a lot harder than it seemed to actually implement that policy in practice. The 2017 NSA contractor with her actual, at birth name, Reality Winner, also was looking to kind of exfiltrate data from the NSA, and she managed to do so relatively straightforward fashion, just via plugging in a USB drive to and looking at how she can do anonymous browsing and things like that to just effectively access documents. She then printed and leaked an intelligence report to the press. This is also one of those things that becomes more political than technical as well. Was this appropriate whistleblowing, or was this just a disgruntled employee? Was what she was doing right or wrong? Should she have gone to jail? Those are fun kind of maybe political or moral type of questions here. But from the technology perspective, it's a pretty straightforward thing what happened. That's been pretty well explored, that she didn't necessarily follow best practices in operational security, and she would probably not have been caught if it was just the USB drive that she used, because they actually never recovered that USB drive. But what she got caught with was by, she printed and leaked an intelligence report to The Intercept, which showed some interesting things. So there may have been some value in that leaking. But she actually got caught out via sort of also physical security as well. So taking advantage of a breach in physical security to exfiltrate data, she got caught via the actual printing of documents. And how many of you were aware of printer tracking dots before? A couple of you. We can open just like a Wikipedia article on it real quickly here. It does turn out that whether mandated or just sort of expected in terms of implementation, I'd click through a few different things here, that there's this concept of sort of document tracking, that when you print a document, that there's actually some pretty trackable watermarking on the physical document that winds up happening. Even on my screen here, it's not that obvious what's happening here, but as you're printing on particular printers, it's actually quite subtle. I understand if you can't see that at all, but there's a pattern of yellow dots that are being printed on that paper. And they're meant to be subtle. They're not meant to be something that you just look at that printout and you can see that those dots are there. They're meant to only be detected after the fact by someone looking to see the provenance of this particular printed page. Originally designed for sort of anti-counterfeiting purposes, right, for people attempting to print money. But it turns out that that process, which had to be kind of reverse engineered and publicized, allowed for basically, encoding on each print of paper, time, date, information, serial number of the printer that did that particular printing. And from those documents, that's how they were able to track down who did that exfiltration of data from the NSA. Feels like when we print something, we go from the cyber realm to the physical realm, right? Right. Once we've printed it, we're now this physical, tangible thing. And it turns out there are, just like there's approaches to do steganography, there's approaches to do anti-steganography as well. So once someone was aware that this would be on the printed page, there then would be methods to then, as you scan it back to some other system, you then can hide and modify those watermarks. But still, even when we're printing, we're not necessarily leaving entirely the cyber domain, which is kind of an interesting takeaway. And then she also did things like Googling, do top secret computers detect when flash drives are inserted? The answer was no. I mean, that was the truth, at least as of 2017. So we think of that as being kind of an obvious thing to say, okay, well-known worms have been spread via USB thumb drives, policies in place to prevent that from happening in the future. This is still not that long ago. This is 2017, where that was still very much possible. In what I would argue is, supposedly the most secure of the secure systems that we expect some pretty good operational security allows for leaking of those documents. So then we're left to what are the actual, USB security mitigations. Again, potentially full-scale ban of all USB devices. And I think it's debatable whether that's truly realistic in every area, in every department. We have USB ports for a reason. They're not just ornamental on our computers, and then we need them for some reason. So I think the rhetorical question there, is that a realistic in every area / department? I think the answer is no. And then my not quite straight line conclusion is the 2008 decree didn't necessarily stop what happened in 2017. You can disable USB ports. From a technology perspective, that is something that you can generally prevent. You can have BIOS settings to turn off USB ports. You can then do some password protecting of your BIOS. It's not always feasible, but there are some options available either at the BIOS level with some OS security. You can also prevent various devices from being plugged in here. The more intrusive option that we do see to some scale, some way, shape, or form these days is sort of employee network and behavioral monitoring. I guess I'm personally thankful that Iowa State doesn't seem to do a lot of that, or if they do it, they're not telling me about it. But you would have then sort of effectively treating your regular employees or users as potentially adverse agents, right? And having logging not just of external things that they visit, which is pretty standard, but even individual actions that are sort of physical world action, right? There are employees that are monitoring via web cameras, the employee's eyes. That tends to be more for productivity reasons, at least in the examples I've read, checking if Susie, a employee, is actually typing when they're supposed to be typing. But the technology exists to basically do that, to do screen capturing, video recording, detecting all the programs that are being executed at any given time, as well as what devices are being plugged in. May not be sufficiently capable of detecting these events in real time, because as we see that they happen extremely quickly, but probably close enough to real time to discourage that time of activity. That's a real tough trade-off, right, in terms of the space between usability of our computer system and the resulting underlying physical security we're trying to prevent. That's not a very pleasant place to work, but maybe that's the trade-off some people have decided are appropriate. We also talk about data center security as a separate physical consideration. You can think of data center as like the actual, server warehouse where all the real important computing is happening in your organization. But otherwise, it's a less mobile computing resource that we're really talking about here, where we're not as worried about someone straight up sort of lifting the machine and walking away with it. It's more about just access security to the physical building or floor or room where these critical components are being stored. So it's more about location access control than actual theft mitigation. Here, it's going to be a lot more about physical enforcement as well as just having strong policies and enforcing of them. It sounds kind of silly to say, we have to worry about things like security cameras and guards and door locks. Oftentimes in an organization that is a wholly separate department than sort of the computer security, the IT security subdivision of the organization, but they become related to each other. If our physical security, if there's no lock on the door, as we've talked about already here today, there's a lot of things that you can no longer prevent from someone who gains physical access to that data center. There are some other things. We talked about BIOS passwords, but having passwords for various physical access to the local device here. Don't assume that once someone is inside the data center, they are to be trusted. Still rely on kind of tried and tested techniques to kind of limit access for those who are only authorized access. This is a pretty silly article on data center security. I like it because of the URL. Lock down your, for want of a better word, lock down your PIS corridor is the title of that article. Someone just kind of sneak into the back entrance into the data center, which the front entrance was well secured, the back entrance was not secured at all. And it is related, right? So if we talk about data center security, it is physical building security. And that's also, I would say, a non-trivial problem. Or if it's a solved problem, it's a problem that has a trade-off between kind of cost and effectiveness and how much one is willing to invest in physical security versus the guarantees or the benefits that it provides. You need to have security to avoid people getting in the front door. So protection against tailgating, right? Which is, hey, hold the door for me, right? Which we probably still do even when we access otherwise secured spaces because we're social people and we want to be seen as helpful. And so that's a little tiny bit of social engineering there, right? Where you just kind of follow someone who has access and you gain access. And then worrying about side access versus kind of front door access. Is there a back door? Is there also issues with regards to spaces that aren't seen as part of the data center, but really are if there's a physical corridor between them and the actual resulting data center? Back hallways, wiring closets, HVAC rooms, elevators, and things of that nature. This is meant to be a little whimsical and not necessarily what happens, but you can get pretty far in life with, just a cheap costume delivery uniform and say you have a delivery for someone. Or this is from an old DEF CON talk of, giving a birthday bouquet or set of flowers or balloons and saying, yeah, it's a delivery, a birthday delivery. Oh yeah, sure, come on right in. Go deliver to this person's desk. There are ways one can gain access. Related concept to building security and data center security is this idea of the so-called air gap. It's kind of an older term that doesn't feel as relevant, but the concept still applied today. The idea, but you want to physically separate one computer or one network of computer from another. Again, think of back in an era where every network connection was a wired network connection. And then the idea is you would have an air gap then, that there'd be no way to connect from this part of network A to this part of network B. Now with all sorts of wireless, wireless networking, then the air gapping, but you can think of it as a Faraday cage or something, but you have some physical separation between either one computer or one network to another network. Literally, there should be no actual network connection, between the two networks here. The idea being that whatever happens on network A, all sorts of bad things can happen. It should have no way, shape, or form any capability of affecting what's happening on network B. So you have that kind of separation of concerns. You also have certain guarantees you can make in terms of the protection provided to one side of your network versus the other. What still happens in practice, though, is that the human becomes the thing that breaks the air gap. Right now, we're back to our USB devices that are then potentially physically bridging that gap. We'll talk a little bit more about Stuxnet later this semester, and from chatting with a couple of you, some of you are already pretty familiar. It's kind of similar to the Command Central example from 2008, a little bit more nefarious in the sense that its goal was eventually to be air gapped over. So there was an understanding that there was these computers directly connected to centrifuges, that there was really no way to penetrate that network in and of itself, but there was a separate network that was relatively easy to penetrate, and it used the USB sticks as kind of that transmission mechanism from one network to the other. and it was meant to stay as stealthy as possible until it would detect that it was connected to an appropriate computer for which it could do appropriate damage to take out the resulting control devices. Talk a little bit more about Stuxnet. I mean, we could talk about it now too, but when we talk more about device and IoT security, it can be thought of as a very extreme example of what happens with IoT and device security. As more and more things get virtualized, and this is relevant for our class setup as well, as more and more things get virtualized and such that there's maybe less on-premises physical data center security, some of that risk or some of the aspects of it get shifted from sort of physical realm to cyber realm. It's kind of a subtle point here, right? So you have this concept of a data center, and ultimately there still is a data center somewhere. There's still physical computers somewhere that are running the work that needs to be executed in your system. But as more of that potentially gets virtualized or located off premises or posted in the cloud, some of that risk then gets shifted from preventing physical access to a door to checking that the sort of virtual access that's provided itself is secured. So for example, there is a physical computer associated with our Ice Age, our vCenter setup here, but beyond that physical security, there are cyber risks associated with that setup. We don't really necessarily consider the students to be sort of adversarial agents, but you could be, and if you wanted to be, you could kind of play around with vCenter and see what you could break here. We have some mechanisms, right? We do require VPN access for off-campus students. Don't think we require multi-factor authentication, but we could, and that would actually help with offsite access. We are fairly careful with our access control policies, but not always. We added a TA this semester, and I sent a couple emails saying, well, this TA needs to make sure that he has appropriate administrative access to do X, Y, and Z as a TA. And the response came back, oh, he was a TA 2 semesters ago, and he already still has access, right? So there's control policies, but someone has to enforce those policies and actually make sure that things get revoked. That would be closer to employee separation processes, something that Iowa State does not do very well at all. And when you have that virtual infrastructure, there's no reason to believe it's going to be any less secure than any other piece of remotely accessible software. So the more you virtualize, the more you push what would have previously been sort of a physical attack vector, the more you push it into maybe more traditional software path. So this is vCenter. This is, I wouldn't say well known because this is still kind of like a niche product, right? But a remote code execution vulnerability in vCenter, which is kind of interesting. We now, I think, have the tools or the capability to understand what has happened with this particular vulnerability and why it was a vulnerability in and of itself. Again, the concept here is we have a physical data center, and there's still the concerns about access and things like that. But then as we virtualize it, right, as we provide sort of remote access to it by design, that then pushes some of that physical risk also into kind of the virtual realm as well. And as you virtualize, that becomes a single point of failure as well, right? That becomes the place where if there is a CVE, if there is a remote exploit for that service, then you have all sorts of effectively physical vulnerabilities associated with your data center here. So the vSphere client, which we've been using all semester, we would not be using the web client, but some of you have been, contains a remote code execution vulnerability with a particular server plugin. And a malicious actor can execute commands with unrestricted privileges on the underlying operating system that hosts the vCenter server. So once you have that access, you have effectively access to everything. Has that very high, so we know it's probably important. It's got that 9.8 critical score in our CVFS scoring. And just another article I was looking at, I didn't post a link here, but I can provide it later, showing what can happen, why this vulnerability was the case here. And it turns out there was a critical function that is responsible for parsing various URLs because it's trying to put temporary values in a particular file stored on a system. And it had this directory /temp/unicorn OVA directory. And every time that result is generated, it would get put into that directory plus whatever the entry name that was provided. And as this person was exploring that, they realized for that entry name variable, didn't have to be a single string, didn't have to be a single variable name. It could be whatever the attacker provided for that entry name variable. So instead of, and I don't know if the example's in this slide here as well, that because one can provide that particular variable to be anything that they want, they can then provide, I think it's provided here, instead of test folder, it could have then been // test folder / whatever you want after the fact. Do we know what the name of that weakness is or that vulnerability is? Yeah, I think that's the exact name. Directory traversal bug here, right? Where by design, everything can be kind of reached via these relative directory paths. You can go all the way down into a directory, then all the way back up, and then down to some completely different directory. That is the job of this sort of URL parsing or directory path parsing software, to be aware of the fact that that is a potential vulnerability. Whenever you now see variable names that are provided that look like this, not necessarily, but oftentimes a lot of things are then at risk, right? Because then you're being able to take what was meant to be a utility to do one very particular thing. Now it's potentially writing files in completely arbitrary locations on that system. And there's still generally a few more steps to get from there to true remote code execution, but there's usually a way forward. Once you're able to write arbitrary data on the system, it's just a matter of time of what directories can be overwritten to cause the most damage here. But that's back in 2021. I doubt in 2024 there's any such vulnerabilities. Also, and this will be our final point for today, it is very common in these sort of data center scale systems to have sort of separate out of band, separate network for just the management interface. And that is just from a practicality perspective. You know, we think of the data centers being this room or this floor where our servers are located, and that is true. But the scale of these things these days is it's not a room, it's not a floor, it's entire massive complexes, right? It's what appear to be almost look like small towns out in Waukee or in Altoona and places like that in central Iowa. And you do need some way to kind of have scalable, remotely accessible management to them. The old school approach back in the days, you'd have sort of a separate physical serial port on those boxes that you would then directly connect to when the machine itself wasn't responsive, excuse me. These days, there's a whole separate server kind of embedded in any high-end server here. This is the iDRAC port. This is Dell's technology, but every server manufacturer does basically the same exact thing, where you have itself the main server with maybe multiple different drive bays there, and then you have this separate, what just looks to be an extra sort of Ethernet port. That is a whole separate operating system. That is a whole separate management server that's kind of directly embedded either in the server itself, or some are rack level, others are kind of room level management servers. And it's this whole separate network card, whole separate operating system, a whole separate physical computer and machine that's kind of embedded directly in that server. Again, the thought is you want to be able to do things like, if nothing else, reboot that main server, even if it seems to be completely unresponsive via the sort of traditional remote access mechanisms. Or you want to be able to get low-level kind of diagnostic data, even if the server itself seems to itself be in a very bad state. That's what this kind of management interface provides for you. It's been very common for a number of years, but it's also now being seen more and more as being an enticing target, when it's not being properly protected. So the other term you'll hear, iDRAC is Dell's term, Data Center Infrastructure Management Software. I'll leave that here for today, but there's also sorts of articles that have shown that as they were introduced, as they became in more wide use, it became sort of a single point of failure for the entire data center. That by design, you have this ability to kind of remotely manage your data center. If nothing else, turn off the machines associated with it. But if you have that level of low-level access, you also basically have complete ownership over that machine. The equivalent in our vSphere is we get to set the boot parameters of the individual virtual machines. That's what we're trying to emulate with this current lab that you're on. But from a physical perspective, that's exactly what's happening here as well. And it turns out that once you have access to that, and if that itself is not locked down with utmost care, then you have basically full data center access if you can break into that one particular server there. Let's leave things here for today. We're going to continue on physical security and maybe do a little bit of lock picking on Tuesday. So come on back on Tuesday.